Friends, moving on to understanding what is sale, because I think the important context over here is to understand when does sale take place or what constitutes sale. Now, technically, if you look at law, it will tell you that sale has two things. One is transfer of proprietary right. Proprietary means the right of title. And second is the transfer of possessory right, which means the physical possession of the goods. So sale is a combination of both. And interestingly, when such sale happens, proprietary plus possessory, obviously the sales tax can be imposed. However, we have seen that in the past, the Constitution of India, and including, say, the enactment of what is known as the Hire Purchase Act of 1972, which was never implemented. Rather, right now, the Hire Purchase Act has been repealed. There was a deferred sale in hire purchase. So what happens in hire purchase is you take certain goods on hire with the condition that you will purchase it after payment of the equated installments. So the sale was postponed, it was deferred, and until and unless the complete price was paid, it would not be considered as sale, which in turn was a problematic situation because sales tax would then be imposed after the last installment in hire purchase has been paid. That is when sale would take place. Unfortunately, suppose the buyer returns the good back or stops payment of the hire purchase price, then the goods have to be returned back to the seller, and this was a transaction that was a problematic transaction because sales tax could not be imposed. And that is probably some of the reasons where this concept of a deemed sale was introduced in the Constitution. And you will notice that today a hire purchase transaction can be considered as a deemed sale. So as soon as you enter into a hire purchase contract, it is sale for all practical purposes, irrespective of the fact that you want the actual ownership to be transferred after the last installment has been paid. So these are probably understanding what the concept of the sale is. For the purpose of contract, for the purpose of Sale of Goods Act, this has a specific meaning, and hence one will have to understand it in that context itself. Now, let's look at the elements of sale, because what are the challenges in understanding sale? Friends, interestingly, you will notice that quite often the government has several legislations, including what we could call as the Essential Commodities Act. There could be a sugar control order. It could be, say, the government passing an order saying you must sell goods only to A agency and not to B. So there may not be free market forces, right? Now, if there are no free market forces, then can we consider that to be sale, right? That's the real question in some of this context. So you will notice that the courts have essentially looked at compulsory purchase or compulsory sale, and they have actually evaluated whether it can be brought under the Sale of Goods Act, because the kind of freedom that parties ought to have may not be there in such kinds of sale or purchase that is done under some of these statutory legislations. So should we consider it to be sale or not? I think you will notice that suppose the government is selling through the public distribution system. Can it be considered a sale of goods? Now it is subsidized. The actual price is not paid. Now the reason you may be asking is, sir, can you relate it to the contract? Let me tell you, suppose we talk about PDS or the public distribution system, then you will notice that should those grains that are given from the public distribution system be of merchantable quality, can there be breach of contract, right? Even if you're paying less than the market price, even though it's subsidized, whether the contract law can actually work, or whether it is the state-citizen relationship that should work. So I think in all these contexts, it is important that the courts have looked into this matter. And so what they have said is, when it comes to some compulsory acquisitions, we should not consider it to be sale. But the courts have also said that they have no problem in considering it as sale, because I think what the government is doing is also buying. So there is no necessary absolute freedom of contract in all cases and in all contexts. So it is important for us to understand the same as well, right? So this is something that is important, and you will notice again that again, the question is whether sales tax can be imposed in such transactions. Now, moving ahead, I think looking at the distinction of sale and contract of work, because I think what is important is that the contract of work is a contract where labor and skill is involved. But in the final sense, there may be some tangible commodity or article that has been given. But because the dominant nature of the contract or the dominant intention of the contract is of work, the contract will be treated as works contract and not sale contract. That is what the court started balancing the interest of the state governments and the central government. Now, if it's works contract, you will notice it can be considered as service, and service tax can be imposed on the same. Let's take an instance of contract of work. For example, friends, you want your portrait to be painted by a painter. Now, interestingly, the painter is giving you service of his skill, his labor, his talent. But interestingly, how does he actually deliver his service? He may actually give it to you on the on the page or the sheet or the cloth in which the portrait is actually being made. So, the final outcome may be something that is tangible in terms of commodity or article. But because the dominant intention was hiring the painter's service, it will be treated as a contract of work. Similarly, if you have to say what is a contract of sale, friends, you can definitely go and buy a painting, a ready-made painting that is available, right? It is something that is tangible, it's an article format, it can be bought and sold. So you may be buying the painter's work, but it's already painted, right? So that is a contract of sale. So the same example can be distinguished as sale and contract of work. The only thing is, how do you apply the dominant nature test that the courts have evolved in India? For example, let's look at, say, manufacturing of coaches. Now, in manufacturing of coaches, friends, everything is tangible, right? The only thing is, how do I fit, where do I fit, what order or customization you have asked me to do. Say it's a bus. Then you want 2+1 seater, you want luxury seating, you want a sleeper coach. I just fit all these materials and give it to you. But the dominant intention in that case may be a contract of work. And a contract of work, yes, the final outcome could be in the form of a tangible commodity or article, but because the majority of the contract looks to be a contract of work, it will be treated as a contract of work, right? So you will notice that in government, we also interestingly issue what is known as the purchase order. Now, purchase order is for sale of goods or purchase of goods, whereas work order is for contract of work. So we need to clearly understand the dominant intention or the nature of the contract to actually apply the distinction between sale and work. Interestingly, let's take construction for that matter. This is the most important case of what we call as the Gannon-Dunkley case of 1958, and later on again decided in 1993, where the Supreme Court again had to evaluate the nature of construction work. Now, construction work is using a lot of mortar, it's using brick, cement, steel, wood, plumbing, and so on and so forth. All these are articles, commodities, and material. However, to fit the same, you need labor. Labor is the dominant nature in some of these contracts. And without labor, nothing of this could actually look to be in a tangible, artistic, livable manner. So the labor has created that structure using that kind of a material. So the dominant nature being works contract, construction work, is to be treated as a works contract. Now, over a period of time, the courts, to balance the interest between the state and the center, to tax these contracts, had to come up with a very interesting test called the composite nature test. What it said was, look, in the same contract, why don't we distinguish between sale and work? Or because this is a combination, it's a composite character in the contract. Let both the governments have a share in taxing the value of the contract. Some in terms of work, say 60% of it could be works contract, and hence that is a taxation that the central government can take, and 40% can be material contract for which the state government can also tax. So the composite character of the contract was brought into place in terms of the taxation matter, and composite tax was applied in contracts which had sale as well as work, and both the governments got their revenue from these kinds of contracts. What is relevant for us to understand here is the whole idea of the goods and service tax, GST, comes from these kinds of cases where we wanted to club the right of both the governments to tax the contract, to ease taxation law, to facilitate commercial transaction, to clarify doubts of how to treat this contract. Is it 60-40? Is it 80-90? What is sale? What is works contract? What percentage of taxation should be applied? Because you will notice that in sales tax, different states had different percentage of taxation. And this also meant that there was something called industry forum shopping. So industries would actually go to those states where the sales tax was less, so that their goods become competitive in the market because of lower price. So to avoid all of that, to have a uniform one nation, one tax regime, the GST law was also implemented, and it directly reflects to the discussion about understanding contract of sale vis-a-vis the contract of work. Now, this is the case that I spoke about in construction contract. If suppose you cannot divide the contract, then you have to have either sale or work. But if it is something that is divisible in the nature of how much can be taxed as service contract or service tax and how much can be contract as sales tax, then it has a possible nature to the same. So that's how the Gannon-Dunkley case in 1958 decided by 8 judges. They decided at that point of time that construction work is not sale of goods, because it could not be divided at that point of time. So the dominant intention and nature of test was applied in 1958, which was later on changed to what I called as the composite nature test. Now, if you look at the problem with the definition of sale and how it resulted in a constitutional amendment, you would look at supply of food in a restaurant. Now, can you consider supply of food in a restaurant as sale of food? Unfortunately, as it was decided then, they said, no, this is service of food. So if the food was pre-packed, if it is available off the shelf, say a biscuit packet, that is sale of goods. But if the biscuit is made to order and you sit in the restaurant and you actually eat it or consume it, that would be considered as supply of services. That's how the pre-constitutional amendment role was. And that is when the 46th amendment was brought in. Clause 29A was brought to Article 366 of the Constitution, which clarified all of these and introduced what we call as the deemed sale, right? So today you will notice that catering services will be considered as deemed sale, and any of the other kinds of issues, like I told you, a licensing agreement or a transfer of right to use can also be considered as a deemed sale. However, let's look at certain issues like fitting of an air conditioner. Now, an air conditioner, friends, you can go and buy it, right, to your home. If you want a standalone product, say 1 ton or 1.5 tons, you can go and buy it, you can fit it, and that could be sale of goods. However, if you want central air conditioning in your office, what kind or nature of the contract it will be? Now, I think most of you will say, sir, it's a works contract or it's a composite contract, right? So I think this is where the challenges still will remain, because an element of labor skill is there. The material is just incidentally going to be transferred. So in central air conditioning, the works contract concept becomes a very critical one for us to appreciate and understand. Similarly, whether contract for printing of books, question paper is works contract or sale contract, right? The final element is in the form of a paper, but it's printing, and printing is labor or is it skill? And I think the courts in 1989 said that printing of books is a works contract. Right, what is a works contract? Just to understand it from tax law perspective, works contract includes any agreement for carrying out of cash or defer payment. Payment or price is not relevant. Or for any other valuable consideration. The building construction is works contract as per Andhra Pradesh sales tax. So they wanted to say what is works and what is not. Processing, right? If you are processing food or you are processing any other material. Fabrication is works. Erection of, say, towers and buildings, installation, fitting up, improvement, modification, repair, commissioning of any mobile or immovable property is considered works contract. So this is to segregate sale from works, right? So we kind of know all of these involve labor and skill, and that's why they are not sale of goods, they are works contract. Yes, the changing nature of the dominant nature test. As I told you earlier, I had discussed the cone elevators case. So it was argued that lifts and elevators cannot be delivered like air conditioners. They are not standard units, right? They have to be manufactured, supplied and erected and installed, involving labor and skill, and there is a technical know-how to the same. And that was what was argued in this case as well. These are certain very interesting questions that one will have to raise. For example, supply of railway wagons, right? Should we consider it to be sale or should we consider it to be works contract? So these are the numerous challenges that came for the definition of sale as against works contract. Now coming to software, the interesting character of software, friends, we have discussed the Tata Consultancy Services with the state of Andhra Pradesh case, where the court said that a capped branded software can be considered as goods because it can be delivered, it can be stored, it can be transferred, right? So that is something that the Tata Consultancy Services case did say. But remember, the judges in the TCS case did not deal with the definition of sale. They just dealt with the aspect of goods. Can software be considered as goods? But finally, you should notice that even if a software is goods, now let's say a software in a CD, right? During that time, today everything is downloadable, everything is online, and everything is a transfer of the right to use. Remember that. So you will notice that, let's assume that it's in a CD. Now, what do? When you buy a CD, you consider it to be goods, right? You think it is liable or applicable to sales tax in case the governments want to apply it. Then you take the CD and put it in the CD drive. Like I have one CD drive over here. I may load it. After a couple of seconds, one dialog box opens. We scroll it down. We have to click the I agree button, and after which the software loads. Right? That's how usually when software was given to you in the form of goods, you would actually do it. Now consider this fact. Now a dialog box that opened and to which you click the I agree button. What was this that was shown to you? Friends, you will notice that what was shown to you was the license agreement, the terms and conditions of the license agreement to which you said I agree, after which you actually loaded that kind of a software. Interestingly, friends, there are two buttons. If you look at it, the two boxes that you can actually choose to click. One is called the I agree button, the other is called the I disagree button. Now, none of us probably have clicked the I disagree button, because we know probably if we click it, the software will not load. But do you have a choice to return the CD back? This is where we bring in the aspect of electronic contracts, where we talk about what we call as shrink wrap and click wrap agreements. Shrink wrap means that the CD had a wrapper, and it says that once you open the wrapper, the CD is yours. That is the first stage in which a contract in the electronic nature of transaction used to happen. Shrink wrap, right? Open the wrapper. They say, look, the copyright in the CD cannot be violated. Once the wrapper is open, the CD will not be recalled back or returned back. No refund. So they may have certain terms and conditions as the wrapper to the CD as well. So that is called shrink wrap agreement. So the stage of the agreement was called shrink wrap. The second stage of such an agreement was called as click wrap. Click wrap. You know, when you say I agree, you have agreed to the terms and conditions of the contract, right? So that is the stage in which the second level of contract is made when a CD is bought. Now, when you say click wrap, friends, remember, you have agreed to the terms and conditions, right? This is like a forceful, what we call as the standard form of contract. It's standard. The terms and conditions are standard. They don't change. They don't amend it, right? Standard terms and conditions. Now, standard form of contract, friends, exist in most places. In today's business context, the standard form of contract is most common. And you will notice that this becomes unfair sometimes, because if you look at the 199th Law Commission report, it has said that a standard form of contract is could be unfair on two accounts. One, it could be procedurally unfair. Now, what is procedural unfairness? It means the way the contract and the consent is taken itself is unfair. Look, I said there should be two boxes. I agree, I disagree. Now, if you click I disagree, even though there is a shrink wrap contract that has already been made, click wrap, you have to click. You don't. You click I disagree. But even if you say I disagree, the shrink wrap contract should not say that you cannot return the CD. Because how will you, unless you read the terms and unless you disagree? So that is an unfair procedural consent that is usually taken in a contract. This procedural unfairness in standard form is visible in most places. For example, hospitals. When you go to a hospital, you have to agree to a consent form, right? That's like an implied contract with the hospital or an express contract that creates the obligation between the patient and the doctor. Now, in most cases, you do not have even time to read it. You are forced to sign. They say, unless you sign, we will not treat the patient. That is a procedural unfairness, right? You will notice that suppose you are talking of insurance. Now, in insurance, what is the standard form? The terms and conditions are so lengthy and they are written in such fine print, such minute fonts that you are unable to read it, understand it. You do not have enough time. You probably need a magnifying glass to actually understand and read those terms and conditions. So you will notice that these are procedurally unfair. The way the draft is made, the way the contract is printed, it is procedurally unfair. The 199th Law Commission also says that, look, in standard forms, there is something called substantive unfairness. Now, what is substantive unfairness? It means that in that standard form of contract, the terms and conditions itself is unfair. See, procedurally, how you make the contract, take the consent, take the signature itself is wrong. And then you come to the clauses in which there is substantive unfairness. Now, what is substantive unfairness? The clauses say that, we are not going to be liable, right? Exclusion of liability clause, or they limit their liability which are so unreasonable, right? So this is substantive, where the terms and conditions are to be challenged as being against public policy. Now, you will notice that what happens in a software licensing agreement, they may say, look, you cannot transfer this license unless you inform us. So even if you load this software and you say, I agree, and you put the software, say, into your laptop, the license agreement may say you cannot transfer this laptop or sell this laptop unless you have taken the consent of Microsoft, right? Because they say this is a one-time license agreement, this is end user license agreement, and this is the non-transferable, non-assignable license agreement. They usually say something like this. Now, this is where the substantive fairness or unfairness of such clauses will have to be probably tested. And the Law Commission says these are the challenges that we face in modern day society, because remember, the power to make these terms and conditions and this contract lies with agencies like Microsoft, Google, any other software company, because they make it standard for all the world, uniform across the world. And hence they will use this power, they will rather abuse it or misuse this kind of a power of making unfair substantive clauses in a contract, and we have to be really careful about the same. So you will find the substantive unfairness in standard form of contract in various stages, in various places. For example, in the insurance sector, luckily right now we have a regulator called the IRDA, which may probably regulate this unfairness to some extent, right? We may have the Reserve Bank of India trying to regulate unfairness in banking standard form of contract. So the regulators will definitely play the role, including the Competition Commission of India, and they will probably bring in an element of public policy that is required in contracts. But having said all of that, friends, one of the most important issues that the Madras High Court dealt, which the Tata Consultancy Services judges could not deal, was the issue about sale of software. Interestingly, friends, the Madras High Court actually evaluated the agreement itself, the licensing, the right to use them. And they said, look, the licensing agreement nowhere has an intention of sale. Now, if you read Section 4 of the Sale of Goods Act of 1930, you will notice that sale is to be understood by the intention of the parties. Unfortunately, the software companies have no intention to transfer, please note, proprietary right in the software. They only give you a user right. So it is licensed to use and nothing more than that. And interestingly, we say it's the end user, means if you have started to use it, you are the last person to use it. No one else can actually get a right to use the same. Now, this is where you will notice that the Madras High Court said, look, it is not a sale agreement. It is only a licensing agreement. So there is no proprietary interest that is going to be agreed to be transferred in this particular case, and hence you cannot consider software agreements to be sale contracts, right? However, you will notice that what the court says is, in this case, very interestingly, the court says that for such kinds of software agreements, it is better to come up with some sui generis system, something unique for them, because it is neither sale, neither works contract. It's a different element of a contract. So why don't we, treat it as a different contract? But if you look at Article 366(29)(d), you will clearly notice that there is something called a deemed sale provision, right? And in that deemed sale provision, can you fit a software agreement? The Madras High Court finds it very difficult to do so the same. And that's why they say that such kinds of contracts cannot be charged with sales tax, right? Because there is an element of transfer of the right to use the software, right? But you cannot conclude entirely whether it has been given that complete right to use. Now, a complete right to use means an assignment, whereas a license agreement is a non-exclusive right? So it cannot be an absolute right to use, and hence whether it fits within the exception provided under Article 366(29)(a)(d) was a question that the court had to evaluate in the software case as well.